power copying versus power negation. Two powers that are in some ways opposite sides of the same coin. Today, I'm going to try to figure out which power is better from a combat perspective, and you can tell me in the comments which one you think is better. Power copying is exactly what it sounds like, the ability to copy the powers of another person. Power negation cancels a person's powers and renders them unusable. So right off the bat, we know that both of these powers depend on other people's powers. In both cases, if nobody with powers is around, they're nothing more than a normal person. But if they can find someone with powers, they suddenly become some of the strongest people around. In a sense, both powers are equalizers because they allow the user to theoretically make every fight an even fight. Now usually power copying has some limitations because without them you end up with OP characters like this. The user typically needs to physically touch their target to copy their abilities, which is a pretty big downside if their opponent has long-ranged attacks. Unlike with power absorption, they usually can't keep the powers permanently or store more than a few powers at once. But if they have power stored up when going into a new fight, they're no longer just leveling the playing field. Each power builds up their advantage, but they're working on a time limit. Power copying actually comes with one big downside that's rarely shown. The user has to learn how to properly use a brand new power against someone who probably mastered its use already. Superhero and anime character origins almost always show us that the main character must master the use of their powers over time. I mean, how many times now have we seen Spider-Man have to practice just to get swinging down properly? So this realistically could put the copycat at a severe disadvantage in a fight. And that's not even including the volatile self-destructive powers. In Heroes, Peter Petrelli almost killed himself and all of New York City because he couldn't control a radioactive power he copied. Similarly, Deku in My Hero Academia thought Monoma's body would basically explode if he successfully copied One for All. So you see, copying powers can go bad real fast and it's difficult to know how bad until it actually happens. Despite those problems, power copying is still very good if they can gain decent control of the powers. Power negation generally has similar limitations as copying. Negators are often limited to needing physical contact like Dazai from Bungo Stray Dogs. There are exceptions to this like Eraserhead, but those characters typically have a time limit. Another common limitation is that they can only negate one or a few people at once. Even with these limitations, power negators are still able to punch above their weight and defeat people far stronger than them. A perfect example is Toma Kamijou from a certain magical index. His Imagine Breaker can negate all supernatural powers that touch his right hand. This allowed him to beat the strongest Esper on the planet, Accelerator, despite himself being one of the weakest. Accelerator is strong enough to wipe out a nation's entire army by himself, and he couldn't beat Toma. Plot shenanigans aside, that's how strong power negation can actually be. A power negator that trains their physical body and masters martial arts is dangerous, and wielding weapons makes them downright deadly, especially if they aren't limited by needing physical contact. Even scarier is a power negator that has other powers. Depending on what they have, it's hard to imagine them not auto-winning most fights. On the other hand, power copying stacked onto another power may not give a significant advantage without a good combination. Power copying and negation are really strong support powers as well. It's pretty obvious that negation is incredibly valuable to a team, but I think power copying is more versatile. In addition to copying an enemy's powers, they can copy a teammate's powers too. Which means copiers can technically double the output of the team's heavy hitters or replace them if one goes down. Copying a utility ability like healing is also really useful. Negation on the other hand becomes a lot less useful if they can only negate one person at a time. But it could still be crucial to victory if they can negate one of the other side's heavy hitters. Despite how strong these powers are, both powers have some potentially really bad matchups. For example, Monoma couldn't do anything with Deku's quirk because at its core, it's a quirk that stockpiles power over time. So copying it resulted in a dud power, which in a real battle could have easily gotten him killed. A more common bad matchup would be facing off against someone who has body modifications instead of powers. Someone who has a cannon for an arm or an artificial eye that shoots lasers wouldn't be able to be copied or negated. This is especially bad since robots are a part of the big three threat types, and both power copying and negation are useless against them. Now, if we remove the limitations and let both powers run wild, I think power copiers become an entirely different beast. Let's say a character can copy powers permanently just by being within proximity of another person. Going even further, let's say they can store as many powers as they want and gain instant mastery over the abilities. This character would eventually become as powerful as an entire league of superheroes on their own, until they essentially become practically invincible. At that point, only a power negator would even stand a chance against them, assuming they didn't develop a countermeasure to it. In comparison, a power negator without limitations is far less impressive. They would be able to continuously negate the powers of anyone within a large radius without needing to touch them. But that's basically the only meaningful boost they would get. Anyone they couldn't beat before would still be tough to beat, while power copiers would pretty much have no bad matchups eventually. So after breaking down these powers, I think power negation is the better power if we're talking about the limited versions. The fact is, power negation will simply end the fight most of the time, and if it doesn't, it grants a significant advantage. That's why characters with this power are usually feared. Power copying has the major downside of potentially being dangerous to the user if they have no experience with the power they're copying. This makes it surprisingly difficult to use effectively, but it's still very powerful. Also, while power copying is more versatile in a support role, I think power negation has a bigger impact in a fight, especially if they can negate more than one person at a time. Few things would have better support value than simply rendering your opponents powerless. But if we're talking about the no limits versions of these powers, power copying wins this hands down. With a potentially infinite number of abilities at their disposal, they can basically become gods. And if they manage to copy a power negator or gain immunity to it, they can essentially remove all bad matchups. It's just no contest anymore at that point. That's where I'm going to end today's superpower discussion. Subscribe if you want to see more discussions like this, and hit that like button if you enjoyed this little thought experiment. If you think I got everything wrong or I missed some important details, let me know in the comments. And also tell me which superpower you think is better. I'm Doc Caesar, and I hope to see you next time.